Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. Yes, do not reset your sets. This is a Welsh accent coming to you today. So this is my full Scottish presenting debut. My name is Huw Marshall. And I'm pleased to say on the programme this week, we're delighted to be joined by the former SNP MP for Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey, Huw Hendry. Good afternoon, Huw. How are things with you?
Good afternoon.
How's the weather with you today?
The weather's very nice, as you can see. I've caught some of it in the past wee while, so yeah, it's been very nice here.
I understand you're hoping for a bit of rain because it's been very dry up in Scotland.
You always kind of expect rain, and you're not rarely disappointed when you're expecting it to come. But I think we've been pretty lucky with April so far.
Yeah. And we're also delighted to welcome Anthony Salamone, an expert on the EU and founder of European Merchants. Good afternoon, Anthony, and how are you today?
Well, thank you, Huw. How are you?
I'm good, and I'm looking forward to having an interesting range of discussions with the two of you. To start with, we'll begin, as always, with the Ukraine update. So Ukraine is seeking solutions to repair the damage caused by a Russian drone attack to the confinement vessel at the stricken Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Environment Minister Svitlana Hryntchuk said on Saturday. Hryntchuk said Ukraine was working together with experts to determine the best way to restore the proper functioning of the containment vessel, or Arch, after the 14th February drone strike. The Arch was installed in 2019 to cover the leaking sarcophagus underneath, hurriedly put in place in the weeks following the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. The February drone attack punched a large hole in the new containment structure's outer cover and exploded inside. Yesterday, Russia and Ukraine's top diplomats used a conference in Turkey to trade accusations of violating a tentative US brokered deal to pause strikes on energy infrastructure. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha says Russia has launched daily attacks at Ukraine since agreeing to the pause. Sybiha said Russia had launched almost 70 missiles, over 2,200 exploding drones, and over 6,000 guided aerial bombs at Ukraine, mostly at civilians, since agreeing to the limited pause on strikes. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov insisted Moscow has stuck to the terms of a limited 30-day ceasefire. Russia's defense ministry said on Saturday that Ukraine had carried out 5 attacks on Russian energy infrastructure over the past day. Lavrov also praised Donald Trump on Saturday for what he said was a better understanding of the Ukraine conflict than any other Western leader. Lavrov said at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum in southern Turkey, Trump has previously said it was unlikely Kyiv would win back all its territory and that he was okay with Ukraine not having NATO membership. The US Special Envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, said his remarks over a possible partition of Ukraine had been misinterpreted. In an interview with The Times, Kellogg said the country could be divided almost like Berlin after World War II as part of a peace deal. Writing on X, Kellogg said he was referring to a post-ceasefire resiliency force in support of Ukraine's sovereignty. Under this plan, Russian troops would remain in territory already seized by Moscow, with UK and French forces stationed in Kyiv and in other parts of the country. The Trump administration has demanded control of a Ukrainian pipeline used to send Russian gas to Europe, according to reports. Vladimir Landa, a senior economist, described the move as a colonial shakedown. US and Ukrainian officials met on Friday to discuss White House proposals for a minerals deal. Donald Trump wants Kyiv to hand over its natural resources as payback for weapons delivered by the previous Biden administration. Russia's ambassador to the UK, Andrei Kelin, has not denied allegations that Russian sensors have been hidden in seas around the UK in an attempt to track UK nuclear submarines. And US envoy Steve Witkoff wrapped up his latest talks with Vladimir Putin on Friday after Donald Trump urged his Russian counterpart counterpart to move quicker to end what he said was the country's senseless war with Ukraine. A Russian-guided bomb struck a house in the northeastern Ukrainian town of Kupiansk in Kharkiv region, injuring 4 people and possibly trapping 3 more under rubble, the regional governor said. And finally, a Ukrainian F-16 pilot was killed in combat, Kyiv said on Saturday, in the second such incident since the delivery of the US-made fighter jets to Ukraine. And now on to the Middle East update. At least 50,933 Palestinians have been killed and 116,045 wounded in Gaza since 7th of October 2023. As an Israeli airstrike hits Al Ali Hospital in Gaza City, the last remaining fully functioning hospital in Gaza City, it is being reported that Israel is expanding its military offensive by building a new security corridor which cuts off access to the southern Gaza city of Rafah, where Israel had killed 15 Palestinian paramedics and rescue workers in March. It's quite sad news, isn't it, that we're hearing from Russia and the Middle East. Have you got any comments on the reports that I've just read out? Drew?
Well, yeah, I mean, just taking your latter report first. I mean, the situation in Gaza is now, beyond intolerable for people there. Civilians, children, and medics now appear not to just be getting caught in the crossfire, but to be active targets. Gaza has become a graveyard of international failure over the past year or so. And, when you look at those figures, 50,000 dead, 116,000 people injured, the country absolutely devastated. And yet we have, this situation where the UK and other nations are just holding this international silence. That's not neutrality, that's abdication of responsibility. And it is a clearly unacceptable situation. This continues. And yet, the international community seems happy to accept it. I think it's a very dark chapter. And I think history will not look back kindly on those who've sat on the sidelines while this has been allowed to unfold. The very first interview I did on this very program after the invasion of Gaza following the atrocities by Hamas, we talked about the fact that there were, there was a problem with Hamas and the terrorism there, but the disproportionate response has gone way beyond any level of credible acceptance now. And the attacking of the Al Ali hospital is a dreadful assault on the foundations of humanitarian protection. And when you also look at the so-called security corridor, which is cutting off Rafah, which has been a lifeline corridor for humanitarian aid and indeed for evacuation, for escape, I would call it, for those terrified civilians. This has just gone beyond any comprehension that you might have had over the past number of decades about how humanity is supposed to respond in these situations and how an active international community is supposed to work together to prevent this kind of thing happening. As we've seen in history, when you allow these things to go unchecked, you end up in very, very, very dangerous territory, not just for the people in Gaza and not just for the Middle East, but for everybody.
And Anthony, we're going to go on to discuss trade talks, but do you think that the focus in the past week on the markets and trade is having an impact on these discussions around sort of peace in the Ukraine and in the Middle East?
Well, I suppose it de-emphasizes them to many people who are sort of focus their attention on the headline issue of the day, is the seesawing of financial markets and the sort of threat of widespread sort of economic disruption caused by potential or indeed actual US tariffs. Sure, it pushes the spotlight away from these other important international issues. I suppose if we look at Gaza first, I think it's important to recognize that there's quite a strong correlation between the response of the Israeli government and what they believe the reaction would be from the United States, given the importance of financial and military support that the United States gives to Israel. And I think it's fairly obvious at this stage that the Netanyahu government has taken advantage of the fact that the Trump administration is much more willing to sit back and watch as Israel takes whatever sort of military action it wants in Gaza, and that it may have been somewhat moderately more restrained under the Biden administration, but that sort of veil of a check has gone. And I think we could see the consequences of that. When it comes to the Ukraine war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think, again, the United States dimension is crucial, and it's very hard to tell what exactly the United States is looking for here. We know that Trump wanted a quick deal. We know that he now wants to recoup monies that were spent on aid to Ukraine. But beyond that, these suggestions about partitioning Ukraine, drawing adages from World War II, it all suggests that both the protagonists and the people supporting them here in the United States government don't truly have a clear grasp of international relations beyond superficial references to World War II.
Just on the subject.
Sorry,
just on the subject of Ukraine, because I didn't come to that part. But just to pick up on what Anthony's just been saying just now, I think the psychology of the US position at the moment is to look at everything to see how it can be carved up. And it doesn't surprise me that they're using the idea of a partitioning type of arrangement, because it very much represents how you might divide a prize between those who want to gain from it. And I think when we come on to talk, and I know we're going to, when we come on to talk about Trump and so forth and the tariffs, then, I think that's where you can see that kind of psychology at work, where it is all about what they can gain. And I think that's the reason they're using those kinds of, terms to describe the situation in Ukraine, which is equally unacceptable for the people in Ukraine who are suffering an illegal war.
Yep, thanks, Drew. And that segues us quite neatly into our first discussion, which is around Trump, trade wars and markets in turmoil. So while some of Trump's billionaire backers got nervous as their net worth plummeted, others used the opportunity to buy up cheap shares. Trump blinked and paused tariffs except on China, just as the bond market collapsed and China retaliated tariff for tariff. But it is all part of a plan, says his press spokesperson. Anthony, if I can come to you first, I think we learned, was it yesterday, that Trump had blinked once more and had dropped tariffs on certain Chinese products, such as iPhones and silicon chips. How do you think that there is a plan at work here?
I think that many people are furiously attempting to find a plan, and I don't think truly that there is one, other than that President Trump has opinions and predispositions, and that he feels that he has a mandate from his sort of win last year to enact on them. As I wrote in the National last week, I think that he favors using tariffs because he feels that he can unilaterally, without too much interference from the legislative or judicial branches of the federal government, that they are a form of economic coercion, which he seems to quite like, and that he can change them. He can apply them one day and say he's going to disapply them the next day, double them the day after that. These exemptions, I think it all feeds the sort of daily theater that he feels compelled to provide to either his public or the American public as a whole, or indeed the wider world. You could make an argument that the tariffs are designed to fundamentally reorient the United States economy by forcing sort of re-industrialization or manufacturing within the US and so forth. I don't think that's truly the case. I think that Trump finds tariffs interesting, that he pledged that he would enact them, and that he is doing so. And I don't think there's that much more to it than that. Of course, though, the consequences are quite extreme.
Yeah, and do you think, because I've heard quite a few economists sort of discuss that, if you're going to implement tariffs, then for it to work, you have to stick with it. The fact that he's sort of flip-flopping actually leads to sort of even more market uncertainty. Is that the case?
Yes, indeed. As we know very well, financial and business leaders crave certainty. They say so. They crave policy certainty, political certainty, any kind of certainty you can imagine. And it's often the bedrock for important financial decisions like when and where to invest. Sure. And the Trump administration seems quite keen to have an absence of certainty. I think that will continue for some time, regardless of what happens on this tariff issue in the short term. And I think that business leaders will need to adapt themselves to a prolonged period of uncertainty when it comes to US government policy, which of course they won't like, but that is the simple reality where they are. Economic consequence of that, there are many, but one of them, of course, is deferred investment, which I suppose is the exact opposite of what Trump is allegedly trying to achieve. And I think that the core calculation for most will be whether or not Trump's policies are an aberration, in which case they will attempt to ride this out and just wait until he is gone, or whether or not this is the new US policy succeeded by the next president of whatever party, in which case they would need to more fundamentally change their business models and the rest.
Thanks, Anthony. Before I come to you, Drew, just a reminder for those of you who are viewing at home, wherever you are, and you might be out and about and watching us on the mobile, you can join the discussion while we're live by using the full Scottish hashtag. We'd love to hear from you. So, Drew, obviously Trump makes a big play of the fact that, of his connections to Scotland. His mother famously from Scotland, his golf courses, and he has some, a fair bit of sort of business interests there. How do you see the situation now with the tariffs actually impacting on the Scottish economy?
Well, none of this is helpful, but of course the fact that that we're not really getting any direction from the UK, from Sir Keir Starmer, in terms of saying how he's going to deal with this, isn't helpful either. Look, for Anthony's absolutely right. Those looking for a plan from Trump are going to be disappointed, but it doesn't mean that there's no sense of direction there, because for Trump, chaos isn't a crisis, and chaos is a strategy. I mean, that's what he thrives on. And of course, he can tack whichever way he wants and just blame whoever he wants for things that go wrong. That's just the way. And for some of the billionaires involved here, a crash isn't a problem. It's just a clearance sale. They'll take advantage of that. And if Scotland, the UK, if any other country has some collateral impact from that, then that doesn't really matter, because that's not in the end game. The end game is about what you can do for the not even for the US, but what you can do for the cause that they brought forward, for their MAGA cause, and that's their prime motivation here. So they're willing to take these big risks. But what we have seen is, obviously, he's had to blink with the fact that they've just been losing so much in the market. So many extraordinarily wealthy people have been losing so much money through their companies that they've had to do something. And I think also the realization that we live in a global economy, certainly up until now, where you actually depend on imported components in order to make American things, that's kind of come home to roost. But it doesn't mean that things are going to get smoother or kind of work out. And there are going to be implications for the economies around the world, including Scotland's.
So, Anthony, having seen what's happening at the moment, if you had a crystal ball, where would you see things going in the coming sort of 6 to 18 months? Because obviously he's going to have midterm elections in 2 years' time, and the proof of the pudding is going to be in what Americans feel is happening to the dollar in their pocket. Where do you see it going next?
The next 18 months. I wonder about the next 18 minutes. So yes, it's very difficult for a politician Most normal politicians like to win. They like to win elections, keep winning elections. They like their party to win elections and be successful. We have very limited evidence, but in the sort of few electoral contests that have taken place that have drawn national attention in the United States, it suggests that the Republicans and Donald Trump are not particularly popular right now. Now, I imagine that most Americans, regardless of their ideological preference, care a lot about the economy, care a lot about their own personal prosperity. I think the vast majority of people will not have been advantaged by Trump's tariffs and his other policies of late. Does that necessarily translate into an electoral backlash, particularly looking at the congressional midterm elections? It's potentially possible, but it seems likely at this stage, but of course, much can change between now and then. I think that is not as in doubt. What is more in doubt is, does Trump actually care about that? Does he care about losing control of one or both chambers of Congress, for instance? It would make it more difficult to enact a legislative agenda, but he doesn't really seem completely interested in the legislative agenda anyway. He seems more interested in extending to the brink and beyond the power of the executive to act unilaterally. And as Drew was mentioning earlier, it does feed a bit of the chaos element for him, that he could have confrontational force leading Congress, which he might like to have a clear enemy to combat himself against. So given that Trump doesn't follow conventional politics, I think it's very hard to predict, which again feeds that uncertainty that so many don't like.
And that again leads us nicely into into our next item, looking at sort of trade, but also how our relationship with the EU. So although Starmer has admitted he had not spoken with Trump since the tariffs were announced, Starmer insists that the UK's special relationship with the US is strong. But to some observers, the UK might seem more like a rabbit caught in the headlights, not knowing which way to jump. So do you think that from that perspective, sort of where is the UK headed? Because there's been discussions around, should the UK be closer to the EU, or should we be willing to put up with what Trump is saying? So, Drew, what's your take on that then? Because obviously Scotland famously, much to Wales's chagrin, voted no to Brexit. Just a bit of context, Wales did vote yes, but only by 80,000 votes. It was very close, which is the population of the town of Wrexham. So yeah, and we're seeing polls now. All the polls suggest that people, buyers regret that is a mistake. So in moving forward, where how do we position ourselves, and why do you think Labour is so stubborn about refusing to discuss closer ties with the EU?
Well, just to pick up on your points about the UK-US special relationship before I answer that question on the EU, it seems pretty obvious that if there's a special relationship by now, the phone would have rung, and it hasn't. Foreign policy without any influence is just wishful thinking in an empty suit, really, and that's the situation we have with the US. And you mentioned, being like a rabbit in the headlights, and the big problem being rabbit in the headlights is you're just really roadkill and waiting to be affected. When it comes to the EU, there's clearly been, a situation where the Labour Party have got themselves into another rabbit in the headlights situation. Where they know that the right thing to do is to go with public sentiment. They know that the right thing to do is to say that we should look to, if not rejoin the EU, which would be all of our preferences just now. It's always been Scotland's stated preference, as you pointed out, and it'd be the right thing to do for trade and economy during a period of time when things are becoming much more isolationist and difficult for the global economy for reasons we've just said. But they're terrified to do that for political reasons because they don't want to open up the Brexit debate. So they're caught between, do they do the right thing or do they appease the reform agenda? And of course, whilst they're doing that, all they're doing is allowing reform to set the agenda. and they're having to respond to that as they're going forward. So it's a really messy, unfocused situation. What we desperately need in a situation like this is leadership. When we have a period in the global situation where, and when you reflect this back against Trump's tariff situation just now, what he's doing with tariffs is basically reducing the level of friendship between different nations. He's becoming confrontational with them. That's got more than an economic impact. That's got a very dangerous geopolitical undertone as well. Because if you're trading with somebody, you've got a reason to be friends with them. And when you've got a reason to be friends with someone, you're far more likely not to go fighting with them. And that's the same situation with the EU. We should be looking to build ties rather than break them down at the moment. And I'm afraid there's just an absolute rudderless lack of leadership in terms of this whole issue over international affairs. On all of the subjects that we've talked about so far, it's been a repeating theme, and and that's a really difficult situation for us. We should be, absolutely members, either in our own right as Scotland or in the UK, members of the EU at a time like this, to get some resilience. At the moment, we've got a very, very difficult situation, and no decisions are being taken on it.
And Anthony, do you think, just taking a step back from the financial aspect of sort of trade with the EU, from a political perspective, do you think that sort of the UK has almost sort of painted itself into a corner? We saw Starmer turn up at the White House, pulling out the envelope, and look, we've got an invitation from the King here for you, President Trump. It's only very special. It doesn't happen very often. Do you think they've tried to overplay the special relationship with the United States? Because what's happened as well, obviously, with what's happening with Ukraine and the US pulling back from supporting the Ukraine from a military perspective, it's actually brought the EU closer together. So politically, where do you see the UK in the middle of this? Because it as Drew was saying, it's become very, very complicated and really quite messy, hasn't it?
Yes, indeed. Where do I see the UK? I see the UK at a disadvantage. This is a very unideal time to be outside of the EU. The UK is not in the EU. Obviously, it's far away from the US, and the UK itself, or the UK government, be it a Conservative government or a Labour government, hadn't truly defined what sort of the global Britain post-Brexit foreign policy exactly was going to be, or indeed how to execute it. Now, I appreciate that if any UK government in that circumstance of being faced with tariffs and such would try and draw on anything it could to obviate them, be it talk about the special relationship and involve the monarch, what have you, invitations and such, yes, but will they have much of an effect? Well, I think we can see the answer to that is no. Indeed, of course, where the UK was allegedly trying to step up and have more of a role in coordinating a response to the Ukraine war in terms of peacekeepers and such without the US eventually undercut that work anyway. What is the UK to do? Well, I don't have a clear answer to that, but I can certainly say what will not work, which is this theory which comes up over and over again of the UK being a bridge between the EU or Europe. Obviously, the UK is an integral part of Europe, but put that to one side, and the United States. I mean, this goes back to Blair and beyond, the idea that the UK isn't somehow the ideal conduit to be a bridge between the EU and the US. That's not necessary. The EU can take care of itself, and indeed will engage in dialogue directly with the US, and will have, and already has developed, a clear approach to responding to US tariffs. The EU itself also has the economic clout to go toe-to-toe with the United States, and the only other entity in the world that has that is China. As I said before, it's very disadvantageous for the UK not to be part of one of the three blocks that can truly affect geopolitics on a grand scale. Of course, EU sometimes has challenges acting with one voice, but again, nevertheless, it does have that economic power in particular, and there are no better trade negotiators in the world than the European Commission. So, you could point at when Trump originally announced his tariff plan, that the EU tariff was 20%, the UK tariff was 10%. I don't consider that to be a great benefit or advantage. And as I've mentioned, and I think we've all touched on throughout this conversation, Trump is so mercurial that what was 10% one day for the UK could be 100% the next, the drop of, and the only true insurance against that kind of uncertainty is to be part of something like the European Union.
Yeah, so I think obviously sort of research, is suggesting that the majority of UK voters want the UK government to build trade ties with the EU over forging a new economic deal with the US. So despite repeated polls showing majority support for closer ties with the EU, are Labour too willing to cede the policy initiative to reform UK? Drew, did you think that this focus on reform and Farage is actually going to damage Labour in the long term?
Yeah, I think that's the inevitable consequence. If I were, and I wouldn't be, but if I were a Labour advisor just now, I'd be saying, look, you have to look at the long game, which is more than getting through the next year. I mean, Labour got into power with a thumping majority. This is the exact time when political parties of any colour would use their clout to get things done, and they've done grossly unpopular things that will have long-term impacts. Why not do a popular thing that has a long-term impact, and but might cause short-term discussion for them? The fact of the matter is that people were better off when we were part of the European Union on a whole bunch of different things. Anybody with any basic grasps of economic realities knows that we've lost hundreds of billions of pounds, and the figure the last time I looked was over 100 billion pounds a year just in the effect of Brexit. So you're talking about an enormous sum of money in trade each year, but it's probably more than that now. It's probably there's a multiplier that will be happening on that as well. So this is economic self-harm. It's political, geopolitical self-harm, and it's an absolute nonsense. But yet they're paralysed by, as you said, paralysed by the fact that first it was the Tories over Brexit, now and Farage somewhere wielding, extraordinary power given the actual status that that he held at that time and still holds now, and now you have Reform again setting the agenda, and a lack of, kind of political responsibility to say, no, we have different values. If they ever had these values that they say they had, we have different values, let's do things in a different way. But instead of just tracking along, getting further and further and further to the right of politics and to the isolationism that we're now, unfortunately, on the seeing the results of in a global sense.
Yeah, and Anthony, you touched on this earlier, and I remember the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," which was coined by James Carville in 1992. He was a strategist working for Bill Clinton. So we see from from a UK perspective, Wales, Scotland, and in England, when opinion polls are taken, the two things that people prioritise are the National Health Service and the economy. So from a UK perspective, we saw that growth in the UK had grown 0.5%, and growth for February and January had been sort of upgraded from sort of negative to sort of no, just being zero. How do you see, from a political perspective, if you were leading a political party, your own political party, from an economic point of view, where would you be taking that party? Would it be sort of closer ties to the US, or or would it be sort of going back in with the EU?
So to my mind anyway, the choice is not really much of a choice. The UK is part of Europe. It's sort of preponderant trade is with the European Union and the wider European Economic Area and so on. The UK is a European state and should have the closest possible relationship with the EU. That would be my position, regardless of whatever type of US administration there is, or regardless of Trump and his tariffs or any of his other so-called policies, that has always made the most economic, political, indeed social, geopolitical sense. And there is, I think there's sufficient support for that. I echo what Drew was saying earlier. I found it extremely odd from day one that this Labour government, with its large majority, has seemed cautious and so timid, so afraid to take sort of not just positive, but sort of visionary action. And it's that much of a stretch to say, yes, reform exists and the Brexit contingent exists, but it's more important for the UK's sort of economic and wider health to rebuild the relationship with the European Union. And so we are therefore going to go do that now. But that has not been the approach to date, at least.
And Drew, do you think, because it's interesting, when you look at the results of the last general election, Labour, a huge majority, and yet they polled less actual votes than Corbyn did in his first election campaign. And some would say that Labour didn't win that huge landslide. They were given it by people sort of leaving the Conservatives and going over to Reform. Do you think that maybe is sitting behind their obsession, current obsession with Reform, as opposed to actually thinking about, where they can pick up votes? There was, polling out this week about younger people, because obviously younger people now are getting, 16-year-olds getting the votes in the UK. We already have it in Wales, and I think, do you have it in Scotland as well?
Yes.
So again, the idea was at the time that, younger people are more likely to vote Labour. What they're finding, though, is that younger people in England want to vote Green as opposed to Labour. In Wales, it's Plaid Cymru, and in Scotland, it's the SNP. So younger people are looking at a more progressive type of politics. So do you think that maybe that that even though a huge majority, why are they being timid? Is it that concern that they're that they can't win people on the left to back them?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I mean, I think there's lots of different things at play, and I've referred to one of them already here. It's interesting to talk about young people and them changing their view, who they might vote for, from away from traditional models. The reason that people choose to vote actively for different parties is because they see leadership there, and even sometimes bad leadership's more attractive for people than no leadership at all. And it is pretty shocking, really, that when you get such a massive majority, regardless of how you've managed to achieve that majority, whether it's people not voting for others or just getting over the line with the percentages, because that's UK politics, that's Westminster politics. There's no proportionality in it or anything. That's how you can game the electoral system sometimes, by having the situation, the circumstances work out in your favour. But they've got this large majority. It's an opportunity to go and establish leadership and go and create something that people will follow. But instead, they found themselves in this vacuum where they're having to follow people with even less influence and base their decisions on another party's agenda, base their decision on Reform's agenda. And I think for most people looking in, regardless of your political persuasion, it's very difficult to see the difference between what the Tories were doing in power and what Labour are now doing in power with the decisions they're making, and the absolute terror of actually making a decision that is going to be beneficial but in some way controversial, particularly on some of those big issues like the EU and so forth. Yeah, and just finally, I'd always like to make this point. We do get votes at 16 for people in Wales and for people in Scotland, but that's only in, obviously, the devolved elections and local authorities. Westminster still is 18, And that's something that should change. We should involve more people in UK politics whilst we're part of that system.
Excellent. And I think that takes us on neatly to our final topic. So as the UK government takes control of the Scunthorpe Steelworks, the decision to close the blast furnaces at Port Talbot and let INEOS shut down the Grangemouth refinery has raised questions over the equity of UK economic policy when it applies to Wales or Scotland. And I think yesterday, with the recall of both houses, the Westminster and the Lords, it showed what a large majority can actually deliver. How do you see the situation, in Scunthorpe, and almost Labour being driven to take on a policy of nationalisation, which again was one of Corbyn's policies and is always seen as a positive. Lots of people support nationalisation of the railways, of steelworks, of major infrastructure. So, Drew, how do you see this playing out, and the impact this is going to have, obviously, in a year's time when we have the elections in Holyrood and in the Senedd in Cardiff?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, yes, you can do these things. And if jobs are going to be protected in Scunthorpe, I'm very supportive of jobs being protected in Scunthorpe. I think what people in Port Talbot and in Grangemouth will be wondering is, why was there not the same urgency? Why was there not a recall of Parliament for looking at nationalising these vital industries in their neighbourhoods, in their backyards? Why is it only that when it affects somewhere like Scunthorpe that we see this call to action and this movement towards protecting people's livelihoods and industry and basic industry in this way? And nationalisation, privatisation, the most important thing should be that we get the right services for people, that we get the right economic and industrial policy in place that makes sure that people can benefit from it. So we should be looking at the outcomes that will happen from action that's taken. There's been many great examples in the past few years of where things have been brought back into public ownership, particularly in Scotland. We've got a number of examples here in Scotland, including some things that industries that people said there's no way you could get to work, and yet they've continued to show benefits. And I could talk about Scottish Water. We've now got ScotRail under a public franchise. There's a whole bunch of other things that are out there. Prestwick Airport, was seen as being unsavable and so forth, and all these things have happened. So the principle of whether or not you do it should be based on the outcomes that you're going to achieve for people, for the communities, and for the economic benefit that we're going to see in the long term. It shouldn't be some kind of politics by postcode, which seems to be the situation that we're in at the moment. As I say, I think it will be a good thing if we're able to protect industry and protect people's jobs in Scunthorpe. Surely that should be applied across the piece to people in Wales and to people in Scotland who are similarly affected by these types of crises when they appear.
Yeah, and Anthony, just from an economic perspective, how important is it, that the sort of sovereign countries have these capabilities? Because I think it's interesting. Obviously, British Steel and Scunthorpe, owned by a Chinese company, Port Talbot, Tata Steel, an Indian company. So a lot of the control over sort of major infrastructure in the UK is actually in the hands of other. Of other countries, and I think power. When you look at sort of renewable energy in the UK, a lot of those companies are Scandinavian and German. So how do we sort of change things from an economic perspective? Then we talk about nationalisation, but why isn't sort of UK PLC investing in UK businesses?
Well, that's an interesting question. I suppose I don't necessarily have the answer to that. When it comes to who invests in the UK and what they invest in, I think that links to broader questions of what the UK's industrial policy is or should be, and what its geopolitical orientation is now when the UK was in the EU. And indeed, I'd be fine saying it now. I don't see any problem with sort of EU or European companies owning sort of infrastructure in the UK, given that the UK is part of that European family. When it comes to countries which the UK has a more confrontational or a stronger difference of views or values, then I imagine that does become more of a question if you're going to have companies from those countries owning key parts of infrastructure in the UK. You need to have a good policy on that. I think there was some development on that direction about sort of screening foreign investment more rigorously. A question is perhaps why wasn't that done earlier, and indeed resulting in the ownership of British Steel at this particular stage. But when you have the state involved in running private enterprise or entities that were formerly private, I think it's clear that the outcomes can be mixed. I think that there's much stronger public support for utilities. So rail, yes; water, yes; maybe even energy being publicly run. When it comes to something like sort of manufacturing and steel and so on, I think it would be interesting to see what the UK government does in terms of how it proposes to manage it and who they get to manage it for, what the sort of transition is, the time frame for that, what the plan is, because I wouldn't necessarily expect the UK government to be adept at running steelworks.
And Drew, those of us of a certain age will remember when things in Britain were state-owned. British Rail, famously, or British Steel, but everything, when it was state-owned, they were all terrible. Sell it off, Margaret Thatcher, everything's going to be great. It's almost like the chickens coming home to roost, sort of 40 years later. But when we look at state ownership, I think France is a good example where they're more heavily involved in the ownership of things like energy infrastructure. Do you think that how do we go back to that, having that trust in state ownership when maybe now is the time, because there's a younger generation who don't remember the bad times, as people would say. What's your view on that?
Well, way before my time, obviously, but no, seriously, the situation with the nationalised industries before Thatcher's privatisation round, I think is really really interesting, because I think there's a lot of selective memory. Ask anybody about the comparison between the post office or Royal Mail between when it was state-run and when it was, since it's been privatised, and I think they'll tell you there's a failure, systematic market failure. I think you could also say the same when the buses were deregulated at the same time. You look at the bus networks, across the whole of the UK, much worse. And privatising the railways, I think everybody remembers the Beeching situation, so decisions can be very selective. They can be, sometimes they can be good things. The problem is that the eventual outcomes are never really properly examined. It's interesting, Anthony was talking about nationalisation, or rather public ownership there of energy resource. And if you look at countries like Norway, where their energy company actually controls, their state-owned energy company, controls the infrastructure and the resources that actually feed their sovereign wealth fund. That's clearly been a brilliant move for Norway. We did the entire opposite of the UK under Thatcher, and just basically sold off everything we possibly could. So I think there are pluses and minuses across the piece for how you run an industry, but nationalised industries can be run very, very well. They can be very beneficial for the public, and there are certain key services that I think should be looked at for maintaining national control, if not for economic reasons, but actually for internal and security reasons, and making sure that we have the basic infrastructure in place that people need without putting it at risk to private forces. Having said that, there are some times when it can benefit. And I think the difficulty we've had is that we've had people on both sides of the divide saying there is only one way or there is another. That's not the case, but it should be done on what's going to be best in terms of the outcomes for people. And I think there's lots of things that we should be looking at now to say, should we, and energy is a great example, should we be looking at what we can actually make sure that we get a return for, particularly as we go forward? What we can get a return for that we can reinvest, as opposed to all of that going to private enterprise.
When I mentioned a few minutes ago that there were good examples within the EU of states' involvement, I saw you nodding, Anthony. Have you got examples within the EU of where sort of state intervention has been beneficial?
No immediate example springs to mind, but I was nodding because it is quite true that different European countries have tried approaches of a sort of state ownership with varying degrees of success. The French are very keen on it. Of course, EDF is a big example of a sort of a laterally majority state owned, if I remember correctly. Other countries, not necessarily the case. If you look at Alitalia, and I think it's ITA Airlines now in Italy, for example, maybe not exactly a roaring success. The point is, as Drew was alluding to, there are yes, indeed, and the occasional other airports elsewhere in in Scotland or indeed anywhere else. But I think, as Drew was saying, the point is that it's worth looking at what other countries, other European countries in particular, have done in sectors of interest and what we can learn from that. Both the cases where things seem to have worked well and where they have not worked particularly well.
But it's interesting because you mentioned, sort of the airport, from a Scottish perspective, being seen as a success. In Wales, we have Cardiff Airport, which was taken into ownership by the government, and is just seen as a money pit. So they're just shoveling in money. It's loss making. So sometimes it just has to come down to the to the business case, I suppose, doesn't it? You can't. Not everything is going to be successful. You need to decide what to do. But it is interesting from a devolved perspective that is happening. Because I was just going to say, sort of railways in Wales, those are now under government control, and there's been investment there. So Drew. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting case looking at the success or otherwise of nationalised industries. Now, like I say, I would make a case for there's two sides to the argument. There are places when private industry can do a better job, but there's quite a lot of cases where where state-owned industries can actually work well as well. I think part of the overall problem is that we tend to make snap judgments without looking at a longer-term plan. So there are going to be, for example, I don't know how long Cardiff Airport has been under, government control, but it can sometimes take many years for the investment that's required, for the turnaround that's required to actually show a return or a dividend in those important industries. And I think if, when we look at the press, when something's taken over, they go, oh, we wasted X amount of money, hundreds of millions on this and has been spent on that, and that's not working properly. And quite often, when you look over a further period of time, you can find actually that money's been recouped and that things are making a profit. And I think Prestwick's a really good example of that. It came under enormous fire right at the beginning, and now we don't hear about it because it's kind of doing okay with it. But if we've got time to indulge me with one little story, I think one of the interesting things about when we set up things with the right outcome, I'm a big fan of the Edinburgh Public Bus Network, what's known as LRT now, because I think it's a really good example of where it didn't start out as a business. When the old Edinburgh Corporation set it up, they set it up as an entity to link different communities, and hadn't really considered the kind of profit-making angle of it. They weren't as sophisticated enough back then, to the best of my knowledge, to know that was the case, or at least there's no evidence to say that's what they were doing with it. But they set up this network that linked communities. And it took a while to get going, but then it became really efficient at linking communities. And then it became fabulously profitable. And that's a publicly owned company, So there are great examples of where doing the right thing can pay off as long as the outcomes support, what you're trying to achieve with it.
I've just checked. 2013 is when Welsh Government
Oh,
purchased
in that case, the
52
Cardiff
million pounds.
airport's got a while to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much, both of you. It's been a really interesting sort of discussion. So, before we just finish, the National Yes Registry is launching its Get Counted for Independence campaign this weekend via the Indie app. The grassroots initiative aims to connect and publicly count supporters of Scottish independence across the country. So the campaign's aims are to break out of the activist bubble and engage the ordinary Yes supporters, count and network as many of Scotland's already convinced Yes majority as possible, and make that currently ignored Yes majority permanently visible through a grassroots-run, non-party political national Yes count. So you can find out more at www.nationalyesregistry.scot. So yeah, that's it. Yeah. So Drew, can I just come back to you? Is that something you were aware of?
Well, it's something I've just found out about myself, so I'm definitely going to go and check it out in more detail. Look, we need to get some enthusiasm and some energy back into the campaign for Scottish independence. We've been doing this whole programme and lots of other programmes like it, which point out why Scotland should have its voice not only locally determining what we need to do, but also internationally determining how we respond to things, so that we can represent the people of Scotland better. And for different reasons, we've been in a situation where things have been a little bit on the back burner. We need to bring it forward into the front of people's consciousness. And anything that can do that sounds like a great idea. Anything that can do that is going to be helpful for that campaign.
I'm just aware of time, but before, just again on this point, Anthony, because it's interesting when we're looking at what's happening with the United States now, because they are literally burning their bridges, because we talked about the UK as a bridge. Like I say, those bridges are literally being burned. Do you see things like what's happening in the United States having an impact on the indie movements in places like Scotland and Wales and sort of unification of Ireland, for example?
To tell, kind of multifaceted. Appreciate we don't have much time. I think the short answer is that this is geopolitical uncertainty, which on the one hand might make people less likely to opt for a major change like independence, but at the same time it means that you can't always rely on the kinds of external relationships that you thought you had, which means that maybe it makes more sense to act with your own voice in the world, or indeed be part of a larger bloc like the EU.
Oh, thank you, Anthony, for being so concise. Before I go, I just wanted to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We were 16,000 short of our funding requirements in 2024, which has left us short of the money we need to pay our bills. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,500. We have raised over £8,500 this year so far, but we still urgently need to raise at least £3,500 now to pay our most urgent bills. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guests, Drew Hendry and Anthony Salamone. Goodbye, and thank you for watching. Diolch yn fawr iawn.